Section 4.3 is about biological succession. Succession happens when we have an area where there is no life at all, and we have a gradual change where we have some species coming in and then gradually being replaced by others. And when succession happens, it happens in a specific pattern, and there are 3 stages to succession. The first stage is where we see pioneer species. These are the first species that appear in an area, so they are always producers. Small grasses, small plants, etc. And then over time we will get more producers as well. Once we have producers and our pioneer species in an area, then we would set up what we call a cereal community. A cereal community is producers and consumers and in an ecosystem, but they are what we would term a temporary population. They're not staying in this area or this way for a long time. Eventually, once the cereal community is established, then a climax community will follow. The climax community is a population that will remain stable for a long time. Things such as soil, climate, and other abiotic factors determine what kind of climax community we would have. Another word for a climax community might be a biome. So a particular biome ecosystem that is the standard for that particular area. There are 2 kinds of succession. The first one we're going to talk about is primary succession. In primary succession, we begin with bare rock. That's really the key to remember what primary succession is about. There was no previous life here before. So before we can really get any kind of life, we have to first produce some soil. So the bare rock has to be converted into soil, and that happens through typically lichens. Once the lichens help to produce the soil, then we begin getting some more of our pioneer species. And we see mosses and ferns and so on. And then we'll be getting some larger organisms in the cereal community. And eventually, over time, we would come to what we would call the climax community. So what are lichens, you may ask? Well, lichens are pioneer species, and they're typically found growing on rocks, as well as maybe bricks, or even on dead trees. And they look like kind of gray or gray-green or orangish, flaky stuff growing. They are actually a symbiotic relationship between a fungi and typically a photosynthetic algae. So this is actually a combination of 2 organisms living together. But what a lichen is able to do is actually able to attach itself to the rock or the brick and actually begin breaking it down through its biological processes. And this initial breaking down of the rock is what leads to the production of soil. Now, where would we see primary succession happening? Well, 2 good examples would be we would see it after a volcanic eruption, where all of the life was wiped out from the volcanic eruption, and new pioneer species would begin there. We would also see it in a glacier, where a glacier was retreating, and once the glacier retreats, then that bare soil and rock is exposed. The second kind of succession that we're going to talk about is what we call secondary succession. Secondary succession typically occurs after some sort of natural or man-made disaster, such as a forest fire. And the difference between secondary succession is here, soil is not destroyed. So in primary succession, we have to first make the soil, whereas in secondary succession, the soil is already made. So here this picture kind of shows what was going on in a secondary succession pattern, where we start initially with no life after a man-made or natural fire, and then we begin seeing the pioneer species, And then after 5 to 10 years, we would begin what we would term the cereal community, and eventually a mature forest, what we call the climax community. A good example of succession, it can be seen at Yellowstone National Park. If you've ever been to Yellowstone National Park, in 1988 they had massive wildfires where millions of acres were burned. And the following pictures were actually taken at Yellowstone National Park a few years ago. Immediately after the fire, you can see all of the organisms are dead and burned, and there's no life whatsoever. The first thing that we'll see is the evidence of pioneer species, small grasses, small ferns, and so on in the area. We begin to see evidence of a cereal community. We have small trees and grasses covering the whole area. An interesting thing to note is that many species actually are adapted to live in fire-prone regions. Many of the pines in Yellowstone National Forest have pine cones that are sealed up by rosin, and this rosin seals the seeds inside the pine cone. And the only time that the seeds are released is by the heat of a fire cracking and releasing the seeds. So this then releases the seeds, and they're ready to immediately begin regenerating and begin that succession process right after the fire. There are many other species of plants that are also fire adapted, and including things like grasses. Their root systems actually are below the ground and remain unharmed. And actually, after a fire, plants like this commonly increase in their productivity. On land is not the only place where we see succession happening. We can see that happening in other places like freshwater lakes. And we have a large lake, and over time sediments begin to accumulate, gradually filling in where we once had no soil. Now we have gradually over time a new climax community. Looking at these two pictures, can you tell which is which type of succession? One is primary and one is secondary. Primary succession is over here because, as you can see, it begins with bare soil, bare rock, and no soil. This is secondary succession because we begin and already have the soil in place. Can you identify the 3 stages of succession? Here in the front of the picture, we have pioneer species. In the center in the back region, we have what we would call a cereal community. And in the very back to the left would be what we would term the climax community. So the 3 stages: pioneer stage 1, cereal stage 2, and climax community stage 3.